going to start, and I would like to very much welcome you to today's webinar, How to Draft Great OKRs. And of course, a lot of the organizations that introduce OKRs would like to improve alignment and focus. And we're really focusing on the drafting aspect today. Yeah, very, very happy to have you. Maybe just one word about myself. My name is Simon. You can also say Simon. I'm the head of customer success at Workpath, and Workpath is a Munich-based software company that helps organizations to better execute their strategy and essentially have a way to analyze how well the organization is working, not only with OKRs, but in terms of the entire strategy execution process. So if you have any questions, of course, feel free to reach out to me. In regards to today's session, we essentially have two options to communicate. One is to use the chat, and this is something for the informal part that we're going to use. And then for questions that you are more than welcome to ask, I would kindly ask you to use the Q&A section. So in German, it might be called F&A, so Fragen und Antworten, but if you are an English user in the Zoom tool, it will be called Q&A, and post your questions there. And you're very welcome to ask questions throughout the webinar. And then at the end of the session, we're going to answer those. And of course, you can also ask questions then. And if you accidentally drop questions in the Q&A in the chat functionality, we will make sure to also watch out for that as well. I do have Teresa with me today. She is also part of the Workpath team and might pop up in the chat or in the Q&A section. So don't be surprised. So what we'd like to talk about today, of course, the first introduction we would like to do, that's kind of the key part, is talk about what makes great OKRs. And we would like to somewhat take it from the angle of what are the pitfalls. And this is just one perspective on it that we've gathered from lots of work with customers. And then we would like to take a quick but specific look at drafting workshops. And of course, we're also very much excited to hear some of your insights. So if you have any learnings that you would like to share, feel free to drop them in the chat as well, ask any questions about drafting workshops as well. At the end of today, we will do a Q&A section, that's basically it. Unless you have any questions, we would just start. And Thomas just asked if we could have the slides. Yes, of course, you can have both. You will have, after the session, you will get some follow-up information. On the one hand, you can find additional content that you might want to have from our platform, and you will get the slide presentation from today, as well as the recording. So you can always go back and rewatch something or slow me down. I've gotten feedback in the past that I might have been talking too fast, and you can also feedback that during the session, of course. Cool. Yeah, thank you, Christina. Perfect. So I did introduce Workpath. If you are interested in getting to know us or to potentially work together, of course, you can reach out. There are multiple ways to do so, but today the focus is, of course, on the process. Perfect. All right. So what makes great OKRs? And maybe one thing to say before we started the section, in many organizations, when you leverage OKRs over time, you will definitely customize the way you do OKRs to the needs of the organization and to the reality of the organization. And that's incredibly important for several reasons, but mainly because you're not doing OKRs for OKRs' sake, right? You are trying to achieve something with this, and there is hopefully or usually a reason why you're introducing OKRs. On a generic level, of course, it's mainly about executing your strategy, but on a particular level, it really comes down to really what the organization would like to achieve in a given time frame. And the other reason why this is incredibly important is because a lot of organizations that are currently in the process or have been in the last 2 to 3 years of introducing this are organizations that cannot just flip a switch and you can perfectly execute the blueprint that you might see from other organizations, right? Like a lot of the things that is quote unquote expected from the OKR framework is something that you might not be able to do in the first year. And that's totally okay. And it's very important to make sure that this is something you're aware of, because otherwise you might get frustrated quite quickly and you are really missing out also on some of the value or seeing some of the value that you might be getting while like reflecting on how far you're still away from doing this perfectly. So that's just as a quick introduction. So today we do have quite a broad range. So we have everything from 0 draftings to 30, or I don't even know anymore how many draftings. But I would like to give a quick introduction. So on a general note, the OKR framework is about executing your organization's strategy. And you can also call it an agile leadership goal management framework, but it's really about getting from the long-term strategy to actual results. And this means filling the gap from a long-term strategy that in many cases is in a PowerPoint presentation maybe, and the actual day-to-day work of the teams. And there have been or are different ways of doing this, but OKRs are a really good way to do this in today's working model of organizations, where it's a lot about autonomy, about having flexibility, and giving a lot of the power also to teams to decide what they're going to be working on, because that's just the necessity of kind of markets moving much quicker. So it's really about connecting long-term strategic artifacts and the operative level over time. It has a lot to do with having fixed cycles for the strategy process. And this is important on the one hand, because you can adapt your strategy and be quicker in like navigating. On the other hand, it is also incredibly important because you can really learn every cycle, right? So if you reflect a little bit quicker than you've done in the past, so for example, once every 3 months or 4 months, or maybe even 6 months, and you can reflect after that, it's much more of a learning organization than if you do this once a year. And of course, you might be aware already, you have dedicated goals for different levels, and this doesn't have to be hierarchy levels, but it's about really understanding like how can you assure that you drive the value that you want to drive on the organizational level, but also on a team level. So the key aspects that probably most of you are very familiar with is that if you look at goals, so you have goals and the process. Essentially, the goal, the OKR itself has 2 components. It has the objective and the key results, whereas the objective describes where do we want to go, and the key result has the only job of telling us how do we measure if we're in the process of getting there, right? It has the metric. It's trying to tell you, are we delivering that value that we've set out to achieve? So structuring this a little bit from the angle of some of the key pitfalls that we see in organizations, there are a lot of ways to structure this. We would like to go through these 4 aspects, and some of those might overlap, but we wanted to highlight some of those. So the first one that we would like to take a look at is that one of the key things that a lot of organizations really discuss about and sometimes struggle with or not focus on enough is the topic of outcome orientation. And this starts with, of course, the objective of describing what is the value we're trying to achieve. And in many cases, it seems like one of those things that is discussed a lot from people that introduce OKRs or OKR coaches, for example, but on a very theoretical level, but it has very, very practical implications. And those implications really connect to a lot of the things that organizations are trying to achieve. One of the most important things is, for example, customer focus. When drafting goals on what you're trying to achieve in an outcome way, and we're going to take a look at that in a second, you're really trying to figure out what is the value we as a team or we as an organization would like to achieve in a given cycle or in a given time frame. And there's a huge difference to the status quo in a lot of organizations, where there is a lot of focus on the output level, which is incredibly important, but it doesn't ensure that you're actually driving value. And giving the responsibility to teams and organizations to really talk about outcome and the value really brings them out of this niche of like mainly focusing on output, and by that being disconnected from the customer. And to make this a little bit more practical, if we try to put output and outcome next to each other, we have a few examples on the left-hand side that you can look at that have nothing to do with your normal organizational situation, but that try to highlight what output might be and the pendant in regards to outcome. So you see a few things on the left-hand side. And essentially the output tells you what you've done, and it doesn't tell you the effect it had. So maybe I have studied for my math test, and this is something I want to put down as a goal. Maybe if I'm studying for my A-levels or Abitur, and this is something that's incredibly important to plan, but it is something that I'm doing. It's an output. It's not really telling me if I've been successful with my actual intention of probably passing the math test. So the other one might be, maybe spending more time with my family or my grandmother. The company examples might be that you have a product that has been relaunched, or you have a concept in a specific team that has been created, or that you've executed your roadmap. And all of these don't really control for quality. So if this has actually had an effect, but you can do so by focusing a little bit more on the outcome side. So maybe you want to talk more about what you're committing to in a given cycle is that you actually pass your math test in that year, or that you might want to assure that your family feels well valued. While of course you probably not going to be writing OKRs at home, but just to highlight this, and you might have the goal of driving engagement with the product to make sure that people are actually using this because you think this is an indicator that this actually, that your product drives value. Or, for example, that you provide a certain experience for customers. So there was one question, since this is very much related to the slide by Alex, regards if this is rather input or output. Yes, I would agree for some of those. The way so input and output is, of course, is very very close to each other. And in a lot of organizations, that's in the way they discuss about it, don't really differentiate as much about it. But I would agree. So the first one is rather an action described. So you would maybe even call this input. If you want to slice this into input, output, outcome, some of those are closer to actual output. So our core product has been launched as an output, I would say. But I've studied for my math test is something that could be rephrased to be an actual output. And I've highlighted a little bit of why this is important in the first place. But it really comes down to a few aspects that a lot of organizations essentially struggle with or would like to improve in their organization. So many organizations really tell us that they want to make sure that what the teams are working on, that the teams themselves, when they work, do not have a lot of waste, right? Like that they work on a lot of things that is never has any impact. And you might be familiar with working on projects that have been committed to, and there's a lot of focus on actually delivering this, and maybe it takes like a really long time, like half a year or a year if it's a large project. And a lot of the team members, after like a certain amount of time, already know this is not really as valuable anymore as we thought when we set out to do this. So really controlling for the outcome also gives you the ability to say, hey, we planned this output and we figure out it's not valuable anymore. It either doesn't lead to the outcome or it's not as relevant anymore, and let's cut it. And it's okay to do it because we have committed on the outcome and not on the output. Of course, one of the key things is really focus on the second aspect. In the day-to-day work, a lot of teams in large organizations, but also in smaller ones, have so many dependencies with other teams in the organizations. They have a lot of priorities, and outcomes can give you the opportunity to really focus on what matters and ditching a lot of the things that you maybe should be doing, but are not as important to drive the outcome. Customer focus, I've already talked about that. It always sounds a little bit artificial to say we really need the customer in the objective, but it really creates the it sounds very academic sometimes even so, but it drives the discussion in a team. Like, why are we doing this? Like, actually, why are we doing this? And what is specifically the value we would like to drive in this given cycle? And that's in many cases sometimes even let's say a stressful discussion because it takes time a little bit, but it really drives better conversation. And that's at the end of the day, something that's incredibly valuable. Perfectionism, very similar to the points I mentioned before. So looking at some of the other aspects, of course, outcome is like one of the quality criteria that we refer to, but we wanted to highlight this a little bit because in many organizations we see that there is not as much clarity about what the organization expects from the teams in regards to how we're going to draft OKRs. So really being aware and communicating quality criteria is one of the key aspects that just needs to be done in the beginning, right? You need some kind of a blueprint. Otherwise, it's really hard to feedback or to control for improvement in regards to you introducing and improving the OKR process. Of course, quality sheets is like one of the ways to do that, and having one-pagers and maybe a playbook in your organization is very, very important. And looking at objectives, and we've already started with this, we have 3 aspects that we usually look for. And one of the key aspects that might be very obvious, but is incredibly important still, is you really to describe a desirable state or condition in the future, right? This is a goal, and no matter like what you've done in the past, SMART goals or anything else or MBOs, it's really about describing a concrete state in the future, and making sure that is being described. The second aspect is we're trying to keep the objective qualitative, so not measurable. And the reason we're doing this is not only because the key results is actually doing that job, but because it would be incredibly hard to find only one metric that measures the customer value, and it usually would clutter the objective. So if you put the key results and the numbers in the objective, you end up with an even longer objective. And the main job of the objective is to really deliver the human aspect, right? Like someone should be able to understand what you're trying to achieve, and should be a very short sentence, and it should be crisp, and you really should understand what is the team setting out to do. And the more you make it quantitative, or if you start doing that, it will just not be very helpful. The focus aspect on customer and value is incredibly important. So what most organizations that we work with that really care about customer focus, which almost organizations actually do right now, is a huge thing that they're pushing for, is really about making sure that the customer is described in the objective, right? I want to describe on the objective level, what value are we trying to achieve? And the best way to do that is to say, who do we create value for, and what is the value we create for them? And then to make sure we have a future state to really say, what are we trying to achieve by the end of the cycle? And then we have a few additional things that organizations look at that are not as important as the top level 3 things. Some organizations limit the number of objectives per organizational unit. Of course, this is not something you can say it's right or wrong, but focus is a huge aspect. You're trying to not slice OKRs in a way that you have that teams split up one topic in 2 just because they're 2 organizational units. So you're trying to rather put teams together to do the right thing together and focus on the customer than splitting them up. Of course, they should be derived from strategy and long-term goals. And then there should be some kind of balance of being ambitious, but yet realizable. At the same time, there is not for every individual OKR, but if you look at the entirety of the OKRs, there's usually a combination of top down and bottom up, right? You're trying to understand what does the leadership team want in terms of the entire organization, where do we need to go, and what are the insights we as a team have of what we need, what the customer needs, and to bring that together. And whatever the mix is, many organizations would like to achieve this to go somewhere close to 50-50 over time. And of course, every objective is, let's say at the end of the day, tied to the cycle. So it should be realizable within that cycle. Yeah, just to give a few examples that what we usually see. So just going back at the 3 top criteria. So in many cases, we just had the comment about input versus output. A description of input is something you see in OKRs that doesn't really describe, the desirable future, but it's something we're going to do something when we're not specifically describing that. In many cases, you're really trying to get, like in all cases, you're trying to get rid of the metrics in the OKR in the objective if you have that. And the third aspect that we already talked about, even if you describe a state in the future and you're keeping this qualitative, really focusing on the customer is like one of the key aspects that will help you to drive the discussions you probably want to have in your teams. Yeah, so this is just an example. So in this case, a qualitative way to describe a future state. In this case, that users do not only like find the right freelancers quickly and effectively, right? Like what is the value for a specific user group, in this case, freelancers, and users, the user being the key customer of this objective, and that they're very satisfied with it. So we kept it qualitative. We describe who's the customer. We describe what is the value, and we've gotten somewhat close to a qualitative way of describing the desirable state in the future. Of course, it's not very easy without numbers to make this super precise, but you're always trying to get to that point to do so. And when we get a little bit closer to the key results, are actually measuring if we're on the way to do here, like one of the key reasons or one of the key aspects to look at is that we're really trying to put the focus more on measuring the objective, so the value for the customer, and essentially not replacing, but adding something to the financial data. Because here, which a little bit ironically or like cynically described by Edward Deming, saying like managing your company by looking on financial data is the equivalent of driving a car by looking in the rearview mirror. That is essentially what you're doing if you only look at financial data, right? If you drive all teams with revenue or margin or cost only, the teams are not focusing on the customer on the one hand side, but they're also working day to day towards a metric that has a very long lagging effect. So you're really trying to find leading measures that can tell you if we're making progress, also on a 2 weekly or 3 or 4 weekly basis. And if you're looking for revenue or churn or any of those business KPIs, they have such a lagging effect that they're not really good to steer teams, and they really put the focus only on the financial side, which is incredibly important, but just one of the aspects to consider. So summarizing for the key result aspect, we are really looking for results. So we are not trying to put input or output in the key results, which is one of the most common things you will see in the beginning, but we're really trying to understand how can we measure the result, so the impact that we are essentially promising in the objective. And to do this well, you're not only describing this in the key result, but you also, of course, at this point need to make it measurable. So finding the right metric to do so is something that can be stressful or can be just a little bit time consuming, and you might not be able to do this for every one of your teams in the way you would like to in the first or second cycle, or maybe in the third. It just takes some time, but it's something that a lot of organizations are striving towards because they would like to be more data-driven in this part of the organization. Lead metrics was the topic that we just talked about. So you're really trying to find numbers that can be influenced in that given cycle, and the cycle being basically the time frame that you write the objective and key results in. The criteria below, again, are a few aspects that a lot of organizations look at. The number of key results, again, that's not something it's not 5. It really depends. 5 would be quite a lot. So a lot of organizations are trying to limit to 3 or 4, but it can be good to have some guidelines there to not end up with 20 or 10. We've seen everything, of course. They are also tied to the cycle, so they're time-phased. You would like to be very specific at the same time. And they do, of course, guide a little bit how the objective should be reached, but they're not the tasks that describe what you need to do to achieve the objective. Same for the objective, a good balance between ambitious and realizable that fits your team. And of course, for the entire OKR, but specifically the key results with an ambition level in the metric, you need to make sure that the stakeholders working on this, no matter if they're in your team or outside of your team, that they actually have buy-in for this, right? If you haven't created the OKR somewhat involving the team, your likelihood of achieving it and having the right level of buy-in that you're expecting is just lower. It's something that has nothing to do with OKRs, but it's still a relevant aspect. So we have a few examples in here that you can also go back to afterwards. You look at the presentation. The key things that you see here is that in many cases, if you look at key results that can be improved, they oftentimes drift towards input and output. You're really trying to focus, on the other hand, on the results. So really trying to stay away from milestones or tasks. Whereas you don't have to like throw in the towel. If that happens, it will happen. Like it is something that you're trying to work with the teams on to improve this over time, but you're really trying to get going. And even if you have drafted good objectives and you're really still far away from the quality criteria from the key results, you have probably created a lot of value for the team already, because they had this discussion. They came together, they discussed what are we actually trying to achieve. And of course, you're missing out on some of the benefits, but the bigger threat is that people get frustrated, and they say after like half a year, hey, we're not agile enough, or we're not far enough, or whatever they might say. So increase the number of users. In this case, we would need the quantitative part, and grown revenue is something where we like to get closer to a leading metric, right? In many cases, revenue is not illegal to be used in key results by any means, but you're trying to figure out what are things that we can actually influence. So you might switch the first one to the users actually finding a freelancer, right? Like really measuring this. And at the same time, you have to be really cautious that you can actually achieve this in the cycle. And the second one was, of course, making this measurable. And the third one was trying to find a metric of, for example, in this case, users already engaging with a certain functionality that is a little bit better than the revenue aspect. So one additional way to really start analyzing the OKR drafting process is this step-by-step guide that we've summarized on this one page. And it really just controls for the key quality criteria that you've just seen. So if we look at the objective on the left-hand side, it says we have power users and they're supposed to be delighted with a number of features, and describes what we're actually trying to achieve in that cycle. You can start depicting the quality criteria, right? You're trying to just answer the questions like, do we have the customer or user in this? Do we have a sufficient way of describing what is the value? Why does this actually matter to this customer group or user group? And do we have any way of that we have described in a qualitative manner, which is always a little bit hard to do, what we're actually trying to achieve in that cycle, right? And you can try to do this perfectly, and then the sentence will get a little bit longer. You can try to shorten a little bit again. But this is something you would control for. And the first aspect that you would do is to craft this objective. And then essentially one thing you can ask yourself when jumping to the key results is, what are we actually promising in the objective, right? And you can start then like analyzing the sentence that you've written, that you might have rewritten a couple times, and trying to understand what are the promises we're making here, and what are ways to measure these promises in the key results. And then, you're really trying to understand if you can create a good system where you're promising something on the top, and then you're measuring for the achievement of that on the bottom of the key results. And you might end up figuring out that this is maybe too complex, or you cannot reach this anymore. And then you will go back and forth between the objective and the key results. You might change the focus of the objective, make it a little bit more narrow, for example, and then be able to drop one or two key results and really have this discussion with the team. And in a second, we will also look at this and how this might be embedded in an OKR drafting workshop. But we just have a few more examples that I will jump over at this point that you can look at afterwards. And just to highlight again, why we're trying to get from output to outcome that we discussed in the first agenda point today. It is okay to do so, right? Like in the beginning, you're not going to be able to do this perfectly, but one of the problems over time is that you are doubling the layer below that you have in your process that essentially shows that you execute your strategy, right? You have maybe a PowerPoint presentation for your strategy, or some kind of video if you're a large organization. You have a written down strategy, and then you have OKRs. And at some points, the teams still need to plan output. And they don't, get rid of their project management process in the business team. They don't get rid of their Jira tickets or their Scrum process. That's why it would quickly double at this point. And something that you are trying to create over time is the connection to those layers. But that's why we're trying to be mindful of getting closer to outcomes over time, even if it's not going to be easy or perfect by any means in the first years. And that's totally okay. This essentially just leads over to the third aspect. One of the key challenges we see is that organizations want a little bit too much too soon, right? And this is oftentimes also driven by organizations bringing in, or like consulting companies, or us bringing in blueprints, right? Like the blueprint is about what are we trying to get towards, and there are certain reasons why we probably want to get there, and the organization might even individualize this, but it's really about taking the time to draft OKRs properly, and then not be too critical in the beginning of how close you are to your ideal end goal. And you one of the ways to do this is really to have a very structured way of drafting OKRs, and also being very mindful in terms of what is important to your organization. So just to show that they're not actually absolutes in the definition of OKRs, if you consider your organizational priorities, for example, you might focus particularly on one aspect. So if your organization really cares about customer centricity, then maybe you might want to be very picky about putting the customer in your OKR for the organizational level OKRs, to make sure that the teams also do this. There are a few other aspects to consider. I would jump over them to get to some of the additional aspects, because we're quite progressed with the time. But what I've just talked about is like one of the key aspects I would like to mention here. And this means that if we talk about outcome and output, which is one of the key things that organizations are working on to get closer to outcome, and the OKR framework saying, hey, this is what you need in the objective, and this is what you need in the key results, both should be measuring and describing outcome. This is essentially a scale, right? We just had the question about the input aspect. That's quite easy to differentiate. But if you go from output to outcome, this is something where you can take little steps on getting closer to that. But you're not going to make the immediate jump from a system driven by output to outcome perfectly. And that is also something that is good, because if you have the way you run your project management or your product development, you might not always be able to service this, right? Or to actually achieve these goals. If you have a product development process that's not as agile yet, right? That maybe still takes some time, where you have sequential steps after each other. You do research, you do concept, and then you take a couple of months to bring out product functionality. It doesn't really help you to measure if you're driving value in the first 3 months, right? You're not going to be able to achieve that, and you're going to frustrate the teams that way. So really trying to figure out what is the level of maturity that we can have towards this is one of the key aspects. And then over time, and this is not supposed to scare anyone, but just to kind of give the full picture, you are of course trying to connect the artifacts, right? And this doesn't have to be complicated, but we're essentially adding a component that in a large organization is missing with the category 4, right? Like with a customer outcome, what value are we trying to achieve? And we're using OKRs to do so. And then you are going to start connect to the aspects that are most important. In many cases, you're connecting to number 3, right? Like the output, your project management, your product development, and then maybe to your KPI system, the number 5, business impact. And this over time can help you to really have a holistic strategy execution process where teams can really analyze how these layers interact with each other, right? Like, what do we need to do on the number 4, on the outcome level, to drive our business impact? To have that discussion, that's incredibly important. What do we need to do on the output level to achieve the outcome that we would like to have? And this is a journey that you would be driving over multiple years, and you will probably use the existing systems in the beginning, right? You probably have some kind of a way to drive output and processes and tools to do so. And you might be adding outcome with OKRs right now, and focusing on those two, the differentiation and the connection is one of the key things to do there. So leading over to the last aspect, so the OKR workshop, a lot of the components you've already seen, and the 3 steps I mentioned are of course things that you would probably could build into your OKR workshop, but we did want to give 1 or 2 examples of how these might be run. So of course, they are one of the key aspects to make sure that we have a structured way of writing OKRs, because they are the point where teams and individuals come together to do so. And if you break down the drafting, so the goal setting aspect, we like to describe that you have 3 components that you need to get right. And you might have those 3 components in one workshop, but you might also split them up. And there are, of course, some pros and cons. You can kind of force people to come into one room and do everything together, maybe within one day if you do everything, or you can have an asynchronous way of doing so, and by that not getting as much pushback about the workshop being too long. The 3 components are that you need to collect all team members' priorities and decide on the most important ones. And in this case, team members can be your functional team or cross-functional team. And you probably going to ask yourself, what are the other OKRs on org level or on team level that we probably need to support? What are the priorities for our team? And if we wanted to focus, which a lot of organizations want to, what would be our top priorities? And these are usually topic clusters, and they might be a messy combination of output description or future outcome description. You try to collect those. And then as a second step, you try to write objectives, right? That's always the thing you start with after you have the priorities. You try to write objectives that describe the value proposition to the customer. You try to ask the question, who's the actual or the internal customer? What is the value? What can we expect from working with other teams? And really make sure to craft this into the objective, excuse me. And then last step, of course, you are trying to create the key results. And we've already talked about this, right? We're trying to understand what is their role. They measure the objective and go back and forth. And in almost all cases, teams will rework this. Even at Workpath, it's not about, you never have a situation where somebody just writes an OKR and everybody says, we're done, right? It's always 3 or 4 iterations, because it's not about like being able to do this perfectly. It's really about having that discussion. What is the key of what we're trying to achieve? And one thing that we did want to include here is an example of how a workshop might be run. And this really depends on your organizational context. But if you maybe have a larger number of people in a drafting workshop and you're doing everything in one day, you might have a quick introduction session explaining the intent of the meeting, the goals, why are we doing this, what are achievements from last time, because we shouldn't forget that the drafting phase is usually the end phase of the last cycle, and really making sure that we take the learnings from the retrospective, from the review, but also say what we achieved. In some cases, if you're still early to the process, you want to do a quick recap here. So the second agenda point, how does this work? How does this process being run at our organization? Why does this matter? Then in many organizations, you want to make sure that you connect to the reality of the organization. So you might want to look at the priorities of the company. So you have someone present them, or the team lead might present them, have a Q&A. Again, what's our vision? What are the organizational goals? What are other team goals that we've already seen, maybe? And then you essentially get into the steps. So the priority presentations from teams that they might have collected beforehand. If not, you might brainstorm them there, but it helps a lot for team members to think about them beforehand, really trying to cluster them. You're trying to drill it down then. You're trying to maybe vote or discuss for priorities, introducing the key outcomes that you're trying to drive. And then you're essentially going to the drafting, right? You're drafting objectives, you're drafting key results, and you're starting to iterate, and then doing so after the meeting. One of the key aspects that should probably be done in most organizations is to define owners already at this stage, to make sure that we also have a good ownership, not only the OKR cycle, but also in the process following after us, right? From drafting to alignment to the kickoff, to make sure you have someone that actually talks to all the people that they have dependencies with, and to bring this back to the team and say, we have a collective understanding of what we're trying to achieve also with other teams. Yeah, and then last but not least, of course, there's an important phase after the drafting that I just want to highlight. You really want to make sure that you already start trying to think about the input and output. So the only way to figure out if this is feasible and if you can achieve this and what you expect from other teams is also thinking about the output. So creating initiatives or epics or whatever you might want to do, depending on how you steer yourself on that level. Start doing that here and have a pre-plan for the cycle. It also like dramatically increases the reality or likelihood of you achieving the goals. You, in many cases, want to start with a light capacity planning to figure out if this is feasible. Otherwise, you're committing to something you can't achieve. and you're really trying to, we call this contribution requests in the platform, you're really trying to make sure that you have the buy-in from other teams if you need their support, no matter if it's actual ownership with an OKR, so stakeholder or owner of a key result, or if it's just a more output level support with an initiative. All right, so I see we have one comment in the chat, and then I will go to the Q&A section. I'm going to read this. So Catalina asks, one more aspect worth discussing is about analyzing and recommending the input data a team can use while designing their OKRs proposal. It's a meeting held by product owner prior to OKRs, planning workshop start, what kind of input data a team can use during this warm-up meeting. Can you share that, the best practices from your experiences? So I'm trying to figure out if I correctly understood this, Catalina. So are you referring to more about like data to analyze what you should be doing the next cycle, or just the pre-planning aspect that I was referring to at the end of this session? So so maybe for both of those aspects, I definitely. Okay, perfect. So it was the topic. Yeah, thanks for coming back to me, Catalina. All right, so I would say we will jump over to the Q&A section, and I will stop showing you this presentation. I will, at the end of the session, after the Q&A, I will show some additional information that you can look at and how you can find the recording, etc. And now I will jump over to the Q&A section. So if you have questions, please drop them in the Q&A area, and we have a couple of people already doing that. So Florian asked the first question. Is it possible to change the key results within an ongoing cycle in case you realize you did not refine meaningful key results? It's a question. It's a very relevant question that comes up like every other cycle. So Florian asks if objectives, but in this case more specifically key results, should be changed. So there are disadvantages of doing that, and the disadvantage is that at the end of the cycle, you don't have as much of a picture anymore of what you changed, right? Part of the value is to be able to analyze, hey, did we plan correctly, and what can we learn from the cycle? In most cases, I would still do it though if it's just a few key results, because of course you're really limiting the ability to work towards what actually matters. So the OKR has only one job, and the job is to be a good tool for the team to work on the right things, right? About being effective. And that's why if you know you would have drafted this differently, and you have the ability to do this better right now, I would do so. I would just communicate what you did and why you did as a learning, so you kind of keep this, and I would change it. Of course, it shouldn't become a habit where all teams change their level of ambition and all those things over time. That's something that would usually get a lot of pushback from the organization. So, where you would rather keep this as a learning, but in many cases, I would make a small adaptation. Yeah, so we have another question from Alex. Could you share some real examples of good OKRs, good in quotes, and then maybe go over them together and share with us why they are good. So I don't have like any additional ones in this presentation, but one thing I could offer you, Alex, is to share one or two documents where we have some of them in there. Yeah, to share those as a follow-up. So maybe Teresa, we can take this as one of the things to share this with the follow-up email. So since I don't have one like in front of me that is not part of these, you are always, if you're in a coaching situation, for example, you're always trying to ask the questions that are the key quality criteria, right? You're trying to ask the three questions from the objective. You're trying to ask like, who is this really for? Is this really easy to understand in here? What is the value? Can I understand the value from here, from reading the objective? And are we actually describing a future state, or is it just some vague thing that could also be a vision? And then you try to go through the three things you've seen for the key results. And one additional thing, you always trying to understand, does this actually fit the objective, right? Like, are we actually measuring for that? And those are things you can always do. And even if you start from scratch, you can ask that questions and coach someone on it. even if you haven't written a single OKR yourself. So I would always go back to that as that. But I will make sure that we can share some piece of content that has good examples and maybe even an explanation of why they're good. Florian asked the questions: do OKRs require a certain way of working? Exactly. For example, can you have project teams that only focus on the OKRs? Okay, so I would like to answer this in two parts. So in the first one, do OKRs require a certain way of working? It's yes or no. So if you want to do OKRs with the actual blueprint and the way it's supposed to be done, like in the ideal state of like having outcome and metrics, etc., they do require a certain level of, let's say, continuous work from the team that they can actually achieve this. So if you are a product development team, for example, that is not working in an agile way, it will become really hard to do so. And this doesn't mean you can't do it, but you need to kind of scale back on the quality criteria on the objective to not frustrate the team. And in many cases, if you introduce OKRs, you're probably also trying to get to an agile working way or Scrum, whatever you might want to use on the output level. So there is a strong dependency between those two, but it doesn't have to mean that you can't do OKRs if you're not there yet. You just have to be mindful about what you expect and that you can't hit all the quality criteria there. And then you asked project teams that only focus on the OKRs. So if you're project based, it can obviously be like in different scenarios. It could be a professional service firm, so consulting, or in other projects. If you're working on larger projects in an organization, I think yes, you can definitely focus 100% of your time on OKRs. You're never going to be able to achieve that 100%, right? You always have additional things that you were doing because it's no organization is that perfect, or no team, but you can definitely describe. And a lot of good project managers, of course, do that. What is the impact that we're trying to have, and describe that in objectives, and then have the projects below and contribute to those OKRs. If you're in a professional service context, such as a consulting organization, you need to figure out if the key things that you're doing can be done with OKRs, right? So if you do not want to involve the customer in the OKR description process, and if you don't want to put that in OKRs, you probably only have 10 to 20% of your time working towards OKRs, and then it becomes not very valuable, because then you're spending a lot of time of planning for only a very small fraction of what you're actually doing, maybe 10% of your time working on strategic projects. Yeah, if you have a follow-up question, feel free to drop it. I don't know if I correctly answered it. Christelle asked, owners are people in the countries? I'm not sure I correctly understand the question. So I did talk about OKR owners, so objective owners, skill set owners. They're essentially the people that are accountable for the achievement and the quality of the OKR in general. And they, in most cases, don't only work on it themselves, but it's a team, and they try to make sure that they bring the people together, because accountability is one of the key aspects. So there's an anonymous question asking, do you have tips for projects that are long-term? For example, if a project makes longer than the OKR cycle, how can we keep the motivation high in the team? Yes, so let's say the honest answer, an organization doing this or having worked through this is that you probably want to slice the project, right? Because if the project is 2 years, you have exactly that let's say danger of working towards something where you don't, at the end of the day, don't really know anymore if you are driving the outcome or not. So you probably want to, yes, you can work with them. You probably want to have a long-term vision and project, and probably you also have a long-term project plan, but ideally you have OKRs describing the outcome you're trying to have. And this might be hard to do, and try and figure out what value can we deliver in that cycle, and have smaller project chunks that work towards this. And of course, you cannot break out of your reality in all cases, right? You might have something that just takes longer, but you're trying to find small aspects where you can already figure out if you are about to drive value. So if it takes 1 year to introduce an HR system, you might want to have the first cycle of having concepts and testing those concepts internally with your customers, so the employees, even if you don't have the OKR system yet, right? You're trying to create a system that controls for quality, work, right? Like that controls for, are we in the process of driving value and doing so in a customer focused way? And you might get some pushback in the beginning in this discussion, but it's really a way to make sure that you're focusing on what actually matters. And what matters is not that you are launching the HR system. Of course, that's probably a very important prerequisite. But the question is like, are you actually making the work, day-to-day work of the people in the organization better with it? Christelle asks if an OKR can be reused in the next cycle. So in most cases, organizations are trying to write new OKRs because otherwise they are not setting a new focus point each cycle. But there are a lot of situations where OKRs will be a few OKRs, maybe, I don't know, 2 or 3% of the organization will be pushed to the next cycle, or because the team hasn't achieved it and it's still important. But the team should sit there and try to figure out, is it still one of our top priorities? And in many cases, the focus changes a little bit because time has progressed. So yeah, teams do it, but just using OKRs cycle over cycle usually just takes out a lot of the value. So Neha asks, if the organization already has OKRs at the top layer, what are your recommendations on how to start involving teams? So essentially, you have a great starting point, right? Because you have a leadership team that already has familiarized with themselves with this topic. So you can straight out start at any given cycle you would like to, and train the teams, train OKR coaches that help the teams to get onboarded and start drafting OKRs on the team level that contribute to these organizational level OKRs. So I think it's a great start. And I would do all the steps I would recommend for a general rollout. So enabling some of the key players that can enable teams. So each team should have an OKR coach from the team or another team, and then guide through the drafting workshop and explain why we're doing this in the first place. If you have any questions about that, Neha, we have rollout guides, for example, also on the website that can explain this a little bit more in detail. What's the OKR for this session? For this session by Workpath? Yeah, so we don't have an OKR for individual sessions. Thanks, Thomas, for the question. We do have cycle OKRs, so some of the metrics you would find in our OKRs would be, for example, so from the customer success point, customer health, right? And this has a lot to do with enabling existing organizations or newly being onboarded organizations in the process, and making sure that the OKR methodology and how it can be used in your context is something working towards. And the webinar is one small initiative that contributes to that, but even more so to our marketing and sales department, because a lot of the people in this context are not customers of Workpath. Yeah, thanks, Thomas. So we have another anonymous question. Which measures help OKR master to create the OKR mindset within their teams? Like when people say something like, but why do we have to do this drafting session? Is it just about showing the benefits, or is there another hint you can share? Yeah, so you're essentially asking how you can prove that this is valuable, right? So one thing that you do over time, you can of course measure things, right? You can measure how the organization is aligned better, how you focus better than like maybe a year beforehand, and then over time maybe you can show we've shipped product faster, but that of course doesn't help you in cycle 1 and 2. So cycle 1 and 2 is usually something where you can only we can actually try to get an impression from the organizations, because it's so short term in terms of the introduction of the process that you don't have some of the other data yet. So you would probably try to figure out what are the key aspects that your organization cares about. So maybe focus and alignment, and ask people at the beginning of the cycle and then 1 or 2 times after that how they perceive the organization is focusing. Like how good are we doing this and how good are we doing that, and do so over the time that you're introducing OKRs, and then try to report back if this has improved, and if it hasn't, ask why it hasn't, how you can help the teams to get closer to that. So should OKRs be written for day-to-day business? Yeah, so it's not an easy question to answer. I can say that a lot of organizations strive towards trying to measure 100% of the value and work they do in OKRs, but no organization like actually achieve this. You are not trying to, of course, like put it like your project list in there, because then you would have like 20 OKRs maybe for a large team. But you can get closer to measuring also your day-to-day business with certain metrics. So we have a couple of things, for example, in Workpath customer success, where we have strategic things we're working on, where we're trying to improve our formats and making sure that they are really good with customers. And then we have a couple other data, like have a few projects underneath, and then we have other things that really measure for the vast majority of what we're doing, right? Like customer health, as a key result, for example, is something that really almost all of the work that we're doing contributes to, and we can put a lot of the day-to-day business could connect to that. But I wouldn't stress too much about getting to that that goal, but you're really trying to figure out like, what are we mainly trying to achieve? The one thing you're trying to stay a little bit far away from is to only do strategic projects, and that's a little bit what I talked about earlier with the consulting topic. If you have too little of your time being devoted towards OKRs, you are going to get a little bit in trouble. So you're trying to collect this, and this also means that it will be more challenging in teams that have more day-to-day work at the same time. So I would say we do have a few more questions. I'm sure there's one way, there's a way of saving those. We will try to figure out how to handle those. Thank you so much for asking so many questions. I would like to just share real quick that you can access more information under workpath.com/library. And you're also more than welcome to join our practitioner community under workpath.com/community. And we will send a follow-up email with the recording as well as the slide deck from today. And I very much want to thank you for joining today. And yeah, apologies that we haven't gotten through all of the questions.